Alright, hello all you crazy people out there, my name is Dragonite, and welcome to making 3D NPCs in Game Maker. So people have been asking me to do this video for a little while, and I've finally run out of excuses to not do it. So here we go. First, a disclaimer. By NPC, I mean something like what you see on the screen right now. It's basically a sprite, and it's standing up, and if you were to look at it from different angles around the camera, that's a little bit of graphical weirdness going on at the bottom there. The NPC will face the correct way, or approximately the correct way. Second, I'm not going to go over how to talk to the NPC or even how to collide with them properly in 3 dimensions. I have made several videos in the past about how to talk to NPCs in Game Maker, and it's basically the same principle. You'll just need to do a little bit of work to convert the system from 2D to 3D. And I've also made videos on 3D collisions and raycasting and that kind of thing, which will probably come in handy when you talk to NPCs. Third, this obviously isn't the only way that you can do NPCs in 3D in Game Maker, but it is the way that I've found to be that looks pretty good and it's the easiest to implement. And with that said, while you can technically just plug the script in and copy a couple NPC images into Game Maker and have it go to work, I would suggest not trying this yourself until you've got a decent understanding of how Game Maker works, particularly the 3D elements. Anyway, time to write some code. So I'm going to get out of here, and I'm going to go and open up this image because this is the first thing that you're going to need. This is Cynthia from Pokemon. This is one background file with 9 different NPC images on it, different frames of animation, 3 facing down, 3 facing to the left, and 3 facing up. If you've used RPG Maker before in the past, this format may look slightly familiar to you. I have set this up so that you can use something like an RPG character generator and just copy the resulting sprite sheet into Game Maker and have it work without too much effort. Next, you're going to want to check Use's tile set for the background. It doesn't actually matter what settings you use for the tile set since you're not going to be dealing with the tiles themselves, but checking Use's tile set does affect the way the Game Maker copies the image onto the texture page when it runs the game, and that will have an effect on what the NPC looks like when you run the game. Next, I'm going to go into Create Object. I'm going to create something called NPC 3D, and I'm going to write some code in the create event. I'm going to go say background equals b Cynthia. I'm going to say z equals 0. Obviously, background is the name of the resource, the background resource that the NPC resides on. And it's not terribly important whether you use a sprite or a background. I just use a background because it's less to deal with. I don't have to deal with sprite images and stuff. Sprite indices, subimages, whatever you want to call it for the different frames of animation. You can do that if you want to. I just prefer not to. The z coordinate, because everything in 3 dimensions has an x, a y, and a z coordinate. And while Game Maker has the x and the y built in, it does not have that for the z. So you have to define it yourself. Next, I'm going to assign a variable called frame equals 0. This is for animation. I'm not going to be dealing with it quite immediately, but it's going to come into play later. And that's it for the time being. So I'm just going to go into the draw event next. And before I do anything else, if I can open up a separate file on my notes on my other screen over here, I'm just going to write some code here, and this is just going to be draw background. And that's going to be background, and the coordinates are going to be 0 and 0. So with nothing else done, it's just going to draw the background, and I'm going to run the game. And there's nothing here because I forgot to actually put one of these NPCs in the room. Let me go and do that real quick. Objects. Object 5, also known as NPC 3D. Let me go and close that so that it's actually named properly. There we go. Okay, so now I'm going to run the game. Alright, this is going to do basically nothing but prove that we can indeed draw backgrounds and sprites and things like that in 3 dimensions in Game Maker, even though they're a predominantly 2-dimensional sort of resource. Predominantly, I'm sorry. Alright, first you may have noticed that in between the different character images, the background was filled in white, even though there was quite clearly nothing white in between the character images here at all. It's transparent. And that is actually an optimization of Game Maker's, unless you specifically tell it to through code. It won't do what is called alpha blending, which is basically accounting for transparency in images. And the way to turn that on through code is to say draw set alpha test, and you're going to set that to true. And this is useful if you're drawing things like large backgrounds, which don't have transparency, and you don't want the computer to waste time trying to blend pixels that are just opaque. Anyway, now when I run the game, I walk on over here and you can see that the white is gone. which is perfect. It's what we want. A second thing you may notice is that it's not here, but if the edges of the image are a little bit blurry, if you see something that looks more like this is thanks to what is known as texture interpolation, which basically blurs pixels together when they're scaled up and down. And since things are scaled when they're drawn in 3 dimensions, you're going to see the effect kicking in quite a lot. Now, the way that you turn this off, there are 2 ways you can turn it off. You can either go into the global game settings, which is this little thing up here at the top of the screen next to the help button, if it ever actually opens. Thank you, Game Maker. You can go into Windows or whatever your export target is. You can go into the graphics tab on the side, and you can uncheck the option that says interpolate colors between pixels, and that will turn the effect off. If you want to do it through code, you can do that as well. You can say texture set interpolation and set that to false. Either way, when you run the game now, you will see that once again, Cynthia looks much sharper. This looks like actual pixel art. You may also notice that on the ground, the pixels are a little bit better defined. If you were to come over here, look at the clock tower, you would see that the edges of the bricks are a little bit less blurred as well. Anyway, that's all I wanted to show. I can close out of the game once again. Next, if you have lighting and fog turned on, I would recommend turning them off with D3D set lighting, is it? D3D set lighting, false, and D3D set fog. And I'm just going to say false, how about C black, 0 and 1, just to turn the fog off. Fog and lighting, while they're not the end of the world if you have them on while you're drawing your NPCs, they can have some weird effects when you're just drawing backgrounds or sprites in 3D in Game Maker. And I think it's just less annoying to have them turned off and not have to worry about it screwing up your graphics later on. I'm not going to run the game again because it's not going to make the background that's drawn look drastically different, but just do be aware of that. Anyway, now it's time to start doing some math, and I'm going to start by saying var back height equals background get height of background, the one that's being drawn. Similarly, back width is going to be background get width of the background. Okay, back width. Frame height, a local variable frame height, is going to equal back height divided by 3. Because we are now dividing up the background into different frames, individual frames of animation. And similarly, var frame width equals, you know it's coming, background width divided by 3. All right, next, instead of just saying draw background, I'm going to say draw background part. And this is going to take a couple parameters in between the background index and the X and the Y position. For the time being, the left and top, you can see the code help down at the bottom. I'm actually going to make this a little bit bigger now so that it's easier to see. The code help at the bottom, left and top is going to be 0, 0. Width and height is going to be frame width and frame height. And now I'm going to run the game again, and instead of drawing the entire background sheet, we are just going to be drawing a single frame of animation. And that's not animated yet. So, to make the picture move, we're going to need a way to cycle through these different frames, and that is where the frame variable that was declared in the create event is going to come into play. So for the left coordinate where the background starts being drawn, instead of saying 0, I'm going to say frame width times the floor of the frame plus frame width modulo, I'm going to type that out, modulo background that back width. And I'll explain what that does in a minute, but at the bottom here, I'm just going to say frame equals frame plus, how about 0.2? And the 0.2 is essentially the animation speed. It's essentially the image speed, if you've worked with that in 2 dimensions in Game Maker before. And with that, Cynthia is now cycling through the different frames of animation, taking steps, and that does what I wanted it to do. If you want the animation to cycle a little bit slower, you can change this to frame equals frame plus 0.15, or maybe 0.10. Or if you wanted it to cycle a little bit faster, maybe she's running or something, you can make that 0.25 or 0.30 or something like that. I'm going to go with 0.2 because it doesn't really matter. It's a decent walking pace, I think. Anyway, what this does is essentially it takes the frame and multiplies it by the width. So if you're at the first frame of animation, index 0, it's going to draw, I'm going to take this little selection tool here. It's going to draw this, since 0 times anything is 0. If the frame index equals 1, it's going to be 1 times the frame width, so it's going to draw this part of the background. If it equals 2, it's going to draw this one, and so on. And the reason that I'm adding frame width to the end over here is just to move it over one, because the idle position, the standing position, is in the middle as opposed to over on the left. I don't know why RPG Maker formats its sprites like that, but it does, so I just want to account for that. If you format your sprite sheets a little bit differently, then you may or may not need the extra frame width. And this last part, modulo background width, is basically taking the remainder when you divide this expression by the background width. And that is just to make sure that you're drawing from coordinates that are actually on the background and not running off to the side of the background and possibly on some other background that's on the texture page. So the next thing that you're going to want to do is flip the sprite up so that Cynthia is standing upright on the ground instead of laying down on it. And this is going to be where 3D transformation functions start to come into play. If you're not familiar with 3D graphics transformations, I would suggest you get familiar with them like right now because they're pretty important in making sure that the NPCs are standing upright. I have made a video a couple months ago on how to use 3D transformations in GameMaker, and if you're interested in watching that, I'll leave something on the screen right now so you can click and go and see that video. But from here on out, I'm going to assume that you know how those work. So first, I'm just going to say d3d transform set rotation x. And this is the first transformation you're going to want to do. Give it a parameter of 90. This is going to flip the background around the x-axis. So instead of lying down on the floor, she's standing up. And at the end, I'm going to say d3d transform set identity, so that this is not applied to anything else that I draw. For example, the floor, or maybe the clock tower. Anyway, running the game, and I come over here to the corner, and there's apparently nothing. Except there's not exactly nothing, because if I were to walk off the edge of the world and fall off, you would see that Cynthia is being drawn below the ground now. So the second transformation you're going to want to do is going to be d3d transform add translation. And you're going to give it 0 for x, 0 for y, and frame height for z. So this is just going to move, instead of drawing the background below the floor, because that's where it is after being rotated around the x-axis, Cynthia is now being drawn above the floor. And this looks pretty good. It's definitely better than being drawn below the floor. But you will notice that if I were to try to not fall off the world again and view her from the side, she'll start to look rather two-dimensional because the game will still be drawing a flat wall in the same direction. It won't be rotating anywhere. And if you were to go around the back of Cynthia's head and look at her from that direction, you would still see the front of Cynthia's face because that's the part of the background that's being drawn, not the back of the head. So we're going to need a way to tell the game what angle we're looking at Cynthia from. So here, I'm going to create another local variable, and this is going to be camera angle. And this is going to be equal to get camera angle. And this is a script that does not exist yet, so I'm going to go and create it. Ignore all these p3dc functions because I probably should have thrown those in their own group so that they're not just occupying a lot of space in the scripts folder. Let's name this get camera angle, and that should get rid of the error message, right? Thank you very much. And the contents of this script is going to be simply var angle equals triple parentheses camera dot direction. I'm just going to type this out real quick. All right, first, local variable angle is going to equal camera dot direction mod 360 minus direction plus 360 mod 360 again. This is the difference in angle between the direction that the character is facing and the direction that the camera is facing relative to the character. It would probably be a little bit more correct to instead use a dot product function or something similar to that to get a value instead of doing all this madness with modulo operators and directions. But since I will admit to having not paid attention in physics class and I don't actually know how to use the dot product functions, I'm going to be running with this. After that, depending on what the value is, what the angle is between the camera and the character, it's going to return a couple different values. If it's approximately head-on, if it's less than 45 or greater than 315, it's going to return 2. Otherwise, if it's less than 135, it's going to return 1. That's basically a side. If the angle is less than 225, it's going to return 0, not 2. That was a mistake. And if none of these conditions are met, you're basically viewing the NPC from the other side, and you're also going to return 1. If you wanted to, you could define an enum, say enum camera angles, and you could fill this with, how about front? That's not how you spell front. Front, side, and back. If you're not familiar with enums, don't do this. I have made a video on enums as well if you want to learn how those work, but if not, don't worry about it. I won't be using them here. So yeah, you could use an enum, but you don't have to, so I'm not going to worry about that. I'm going to close out of this, and this is going to pass the value of 0, 1, or 2 to the local variable camera angle. Now here I'm going to do a little bit of, you could call it cheating, with the way the GameMaker handles Boolean values, with false being the same as 0 and true being the same as 1. After translating it, or before translating it, in this case it doesn't actually matter, it's just important that set rotation x is the first thing that you do to the transformation. Let's try that again. D through D, transform, set, rotation, z. And this is going to take direction plus 90 times the quantity of camera angle equals 1. And this is a little bit of dark magic that, like I said, it takes advantage of the fact that in GameMaker 1 equals true and 0 equals false. And it's basically going to rotate the sprite so that you're always facing the broadside. I probably shouldn't attempt to explain the math because I am not good at explaining math, so I'm just going to run the game to give a little bit of a visual representation of what happens. I think I just rotated you around the wrong angle. Oh, I said set rotation instead of add rotation. There is a difference. Again, if you're familiar with how 3D transformations work in GameMaker, you will know what that difference is. Okay, so here we are. I'm staring at Cynthia from the front, and you can see her face. I move over here, and you can still see her face because we haven't told the game which direction that we're supposed to be drawing on the sprite index, but we're still looking at her from the broadside instead of a rather narrow angle. And if I were to move like this, the game would adjust the NPC so that we're always looking at the broadside. All right, next, so that we're always facing the right side of the NPC, in the top argument, I just made a bit of a major error there, don't mind me. Instead of 0 for the top argument, we're going to be saying frame height times camera angle. And again, this is going to be depending on the value that was returned from get camera angle, with 2 being the back of the head, 1 being the side, and 0 being the front. So let's run the game again. Alright, so I'm looking at Cynthia from this direction. I see the front of her face, which is good. And I move over here, and I see the side of her head, which is also good. And this is pretty close to what we want to happen, except you may notice, instead of rotating around the axis that goes through the middle of the NPC, about where my mouse cursor is right now, I'll draw a line in editing to make it a little bit easier to see. We are rotating instead around this point, 0, 0. And the easiest way to deal with this would be to, right before you do the rotation around the z-axis, do another translation, D3D, transform, add, translation. And this time you're going to translate it over to the left of the x-axis, on the x-axis rather, by negative frame width divided by 2, 0 on the y-axis, and 0 on the z-axis. And this has just moved the origin of the NPC frame to the center instead of off to the side where it would be by default. So let's run the game again. There's a speck of dust floating around on my desk and it's distracting me and I want to... Alright, she's now standing on the point 0, 0 instead of being off to the side a little bit, which is great. And if I move over here, she rotates around the center instead of around a point off in the distance, which is also great. So the last thing you probably want to do is actually draw the NPC in the room where the NPC object is. In my case, the NPC object has been added to the room. I believe it's this one, so it's a little bit off away from the corner. It's not in the corner, even though it's being drawn there. And to do that, if you've gotten this far in the video, I'm sure you already know, instead of translating 0, 0 frame height, translate x, y, and z plus frame height. And now when I run the game again, Cynthia is standing in the middle of the room. She's doing the walk animation. If I stand over here, or over here, or over here, you can see the correct side of her. And that's great. We're done. One more thing to note is that if you have backface culling turned on, and I'm going to set that with D3D set culling true, you may notice a strange effect, which is that one, the floor disappears, but two, depending on which side you're facing the NPC from, she's actually going to disappear. Where are you? There you are. She's actually going to disappear from certain angles, and that is thanks to backface culling. And that basically means that only certain faces of objects are drawn in 3D, and you're going to want to turn that off. So in addition to saying D3D set lighting false and set fog false and all those other things, I'm also going to say D3D set culling false. And I may make it a more in-depth video on backface coloring at a later date because it is an interesting optimization. But for the time being, just turn it off. The script is not heavy-duty computer science enough to account for backface culling because I am just not that good a computer scientist. And that's pretty much it. If you have any more questions, I'll try to get to them in the comments and possibly add an FAQ to the description of this video. If you want to download this code, like I said at the beginning, this should be fairly plug and play, although it does help to understand what's going on. I will leave a download link in the description of this video as well. There we go. Saving it right now. For the time being, my name is Dragonite. I hope you found that useful, and I will see you all later.